Hi, my name is Caitlin Tauber, and I will be talking about the gender pay gap today. Before I go into what is the gender pay gap, I wanted to touch base on who my target audience is for this presentation. Although my target audience ideally would be everybody, because I believe everybody should be aware of what the gender pay gap is, I specifically want the women in this class to pay attention extra carefully because hopefully you guys will be graduating soon and situations like these with the gender pay gap could affect you negatively. And I just want you guys to all be aware of what could happen when you go into the workforce. What is the gender pay gap? The gender pay gap is the average difference in compensation between working age men and women. The pay gap can be divided into two categories, non-adjusted and adjusted. What are some of the causes to the gender pay gap? Some causes could be educational achievement, differences in occupational choices, employment discrimination, or workplace participation trends, such as leaving early to get your children, which we will talk about more in the next slide. There are bias in the workforce, such as caregiver bias and motherhood bias. Going into caregiver bias, it is when women postpone opportunities for advancement, scaling back on hours, or leaving early to get their children. Or going into motherhood bias, which is lower salaries, fewer promotions, and fewer job opportunities. We will now be talking about the history of the pay gap, which I included a little graph that shows a history of gender and income inequality starting from 1944 to 2021. In 1944, New York Republican Mr. Stanley introduced a bill to amend the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 to include discrimination in pay on account of sex, but it never passed through Congress. The bill aimed to amend unfair labor practices against employees based on sex. Going into the 1960s, where I provided a graph for us with the gender pay gap from the 1960s until 2015, which shows women earnings in blue underneath male earnings in red. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 prohibited employers from paying different wages for jobs requiring equal skill, effort, and responsibility, with exceptions for pay structures based on seniority or merit. President John F. Kennedy criticized the practice, citing the average woman worker earning only 60% of the average wage for men. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act expanded the law to make compensation decisions based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin unlawful. Going into the 1970s and 1980s, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the concept of comparable worth emerged, addressing wage gaps in similar jobs due to past discrimination. The National Committee on Pay Equity highlighted the undervaluation of women and people of color in certain jobs. Despite the EEOC chairing the issue during the Carter administration, the Reagan administration opposed it, deeming it a cockamamie idea that would destroy free enterprise. Now we will move into the evidence of the gap, where I provide even more graphs of all workers age 16 and plus and workers ages 25 to 34. The gender pay gap in the US has remained stable over the past 20 years, with women earning on average of 82% of what the male earned in 2022. This is very similar to 2002's 80% pay gap. The wage gap is smaller for workers aged 25 to 34 than for all workers 16 and older. However, the gap has narrowed significantly in the long term, with an estimated 18-cent gap among all workers and an 8-cent gap among workers aged 25 to 34. Economic damages. Due to the wage gap, women who work in the U.S. lose a cumulative total of almost 1.6 trillion annually. Because of these lost earnings, women and their families are less able to save and invest for their future, care for their families and communities, and maintain themselves. How eliminating the gap will provide economic damages or economic benefits. In addition to being unfair, the exclusion of far too many women from economic opportunities stunts everybody's ability to advance. We know that even a small increase in women labor force participation could boost economic output by an average of 35% in nations with higher levels of gender inequality. So, what are some actions that we could do to help the gap? Some actions taking place to help the gap now is the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Countries are implementing pay transparency tools like an employer pay gap reporting, equal pay audits, and job classification systems to address gender wage gaps in the workforce. Now, how do we support women in business? Two examples of supporting women in business could be expanding childcare and adding paid family leave. Such policies have the potential to reduce job losses and improve financial stability for all the workers, particularly women who continue to shoulder the majority of caregiving responsibilities in American society. So, in conclusion to everything I've said, while there are a number of factors that may contribute to the pay gap, including bias in the workforce and employment discrimination, there may be numerous advantages for women in the workforce if employers take those steps to close the gap. These could increase economic outputs by 35%. This is only possible if employers implement trade or pay transparency, expand childcare, and add paid family leave. Implementing all these services could potentially reduce the pay gap percentage and boost economic output. And lastly, I have an example of my works cited. But that is all for my gender pay gap presentation. Thank you so much.